Good afternoon. Welcome back to the Deep 404. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Israel at the moment. The New York Times is reporting that Israel is going to commence withdrawing a significant number of troops from the Gaza Strip. This is being done reportedly because of the impact that the war with Gaza is having on the Israeli economy. As you can imagine, the impacts of moving from a relatively peaceful state to moving to war, where you have brought in 350,000 reservists, many of them from overseas, coming into Israel. You are now needing to feed, clothe and house all of those people. That has an impact for those people who are already living in Israel and who have now stopped working and are joining the armed forces. Those people are no longer productive in the Israeli economy. And tourism is suffering as many people are making the decision to not travel to a war zone, people who would otherwise at this time of year have travelled to Israel. The reports are that 5 brigades of Israeli IDF servicemen and women will be pulled out. 3 of those brigades apparently are being rolled out for training, but not being replaced. And 2 of the brigades are just being taken out at this stage with no indication of what's happening to them. A full Israeli brigade could be somewhere up to 4,000 personnel. So you could be looking at anywhere up to nearly 20,000 being withdrawn if they were all full brigades. However, the number's probably less than that, which actually will be brought out. So this is aligning with some discussion from US National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, who has said that Israel is moving into a new phase of the war. And in this new phase, the Israelis will be targeting high-value Hamas targets. So this may be a changing in the rhetoric to address the fact that Israel hasn't been achieving strategic success in the first 3 months of fighting here in Gaza. There have been pressure on the Israelis to reduce the number of civilians that are being killed. The reports today by Al Jazeera are that number is up to 22,000 people killed in this 3-month period, which is a tremendous loss of life. Reports are that because of growing pressure in the US, pressure on Biden and his administration, that they are then in turn putting pressure on Israel to adhere to the basic laws of war, to avoid targeting civilians. It's yet to be seen whether that is going to happen or if Israel is going to continue with the current process, which looks to be an attempt to ethnically cleanse Gaza. I don't think there's a way to class what is being done in Gaza at the moment purely as a retaliation. The effective carpet bombing that's gone on since the 7th of October, the targeting of civilians, the destruction of infrastructure in the northern Gazan area and in parts of southern Gaza seem to be aimed to make the area of Gaza uninhabitable. So even after this conflict ends, there will be nothing to be able to go back to for the inhabitants of Gaza. So yes, there have been some challenges for Israel here, even in terms of things like friendly fire. A report in an Israeli and in the Times of Israel, sorry, not the Times of Israel, but another Israeli newspaper, that 30 or more out of 170 reported IDF deaths so far, so Israeli servicemen and women who have been confirmed to have died so far in this fighting. 30 of those 170 have been killed by friendly fire. So that's quite a high percentage. That's almost 1 in 5, 1 in 6. 1 in 6 deaths in this conflict has been due to friendly fire for the Israelis. So those sort of things don't look good and add pressure. The inability for Israel to clearly demonstrate that it is killing Hamas members, given that the Hamas members are sort of a guerrilla organisation and blend in with the civilian population, which is part of the reason why Israel claims that it needs to be bombing all of these civilian areas because Hamas is dispersed within there. Difficult for them to achieve and demonstrate that they've achieved the goal, which was one of completely destroying Hamas. There's growing. While there's challenges for Israel's respects to that, also friendly fire relating to hostages, with the recent example of 3 Israeli hostages who managed to escape, who were apparently shirtless, waving some sort of a flag to indicate where they were calling out in Hebrew. They were shot dead. Things like this not looking good. Videos coming out reportedly indicating from IDF members themselves that casualties in the first day and the early stages of this conflict in kibbutzes and near the Nova rave were in fact due to IDF forces. All of this is adding pressure onto Benjamin Netanyahu and his administration. So we see in the region also escalation with the Houthis from Yemen. They're recent examples of asymmetric warfare where they have been able to stop shipping through the Red Sea, well, if not stop it, at least reduce it dramatically. This is causing an increase in time and cost for goods being shipped to and from Israel, as other areas as well, but this is intended to impact Israel. There are nearing 20 incidents now involving the Yemenis and shipping in that area. 2 days ago, Maersk, the major shipping line, has declared that it is not going to be shipping through the Red Sea. This comes after the US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin had allegedly spoken to Maersk and said that they would protect their shipping to keep it going. Maersk have decided that they're not going to receive the sort of support and protection that they think is going to be enough. Things are heating up in the Red Sea area, the Gulf of Aden area. If we just go to the map here. So it's really around this area here, the Gulf of Aden. This is where Yemen is, and this is the Red Sea with Israel up here. An Iranian warship, Dal Bors, has been deployed to the Red Sea. And in an interesting turn of events, just after Britain has announced that it is considering strikes on the Houthis, the UK Defence Secretary Grant Shapps has said direct action may be required to prevent further attacks. And the HMS Diamond, which is a British naval destroyer being deployed into the region, the US, UK and France all condemning Iran's nuclear enrichment. At this time, however, the USS Carrier, the Gerald Ford, will leave the Mediterranean. So it's been based for some time now, since October, up in the Mediterranean here off the coast of Beirut and Jerusalem and Israel up here. The Gerald Ford, it's the newest and largest of the American aircraft carriers. It's the one of 2 that are in the region. It's going to be returning home to its home port in Norfolk, Virginia. It will be replaced in the Mediterranean by 2 amphibious assault ships, the USS Bataan. I think I've got a picture of one of them here. Where's this? Yeah, this is the Bataan here. It's like a mini aircraft carrier, but it's capable of handling vertical takeoff aircraft. So helicopters, Ospreys, Harrier jump jets, that's the sort of thing that it provides. The Gerald Ford and the Eisenhower, which is the other aircraft carrier in the area, a typical aircraft carrier. These things have a large complement of fighter jets, which allow the US to project air power into the region. So, the Eisenhower, it's large. It's at 333 meters long. It will remain in the Gulf of Aden, so it's going to remain down around here. It has moved recently, travelled from the Persian Gulf down to here. So there is still sizable US naval assets in the area. The Gerald Ford is apparently returning for scheduled maintenance, getting back to do that. There's no word yet if it may be replaced by another carrier at this stage. Earlier this week, helicopters from the Eisenhower and the USS Gravely engaged 4 Houthi speedboats in the area. Reportedly, 3 of those speedboats were sunk, destroyed, and the Houthi soldiers on them killed. The 4th one escaped. John Bolton, who's a former US security advisor, both under Bush and then under Trump, in a Telegraph article, he is calling for action against Iran. He seems to have made the decision that a drone that was fired by the Houthis and a ballistic missile that was fired by the Houthis while they were produced by Iran, he's considering them to be Iranian launched. And he says in his article, the critical truth here is that Iran has directly committed an act of war against what it believed was an Israeli target. I don't think that there's any indication that Iran has fired those weapons. As I say, they may have been produced by Iran, provided to the Houthis by Iran, but it was the Houthis that have chosen the target and fired them. Iran is rejecting his calls here and saying that Hamas and Yemen, the Houthis, are operating independently of Iran. Iran isn't controlling them. John Bolton is calling for war in Iran. At the same time, yes, the US, the UK and France have come out and have condemned Iran for their nuclear enrichment program. Now, the Iranians can nuclear enrich. There's nothing prohibiting them from doing that. The report is that they have increased the rate at which they are doing that. And of course, this is one of Israel's major concerns, is that Iran becomes a nuclear power. If Iran becomes a nuclear power, that offsets Israel's nuclear weapons, even though Israel doesn't admit to having nuclear weapons. It is considered extremely likely that they have somewhere between 80 and 100 nuclear weapons. If Iran achieves that, then to some respects that then neutralizes the Israeli nuclear threat, because you end up in a situation much like the US and the Russia have been in for many years, where they are in a mutually assured destruction situation. If one fires, the other fires, everyone loses. So in effect, the nuclear weapons are no longer really useful. Which is on an interesting topic, is why the size of nuclear weapons reached a peak with the Tsar bomber, the big Russian bomb, back in the 50s or 60s, and then after that declined in size, and actually instead of trying to get bigger because these nations, these superpowers, realised there was just no point, they were never going to use them, they started to move down towards the tactical nukes, the smaller things that you could in theory use, where maybe you could blow up a small township but not wipe out a whole city, and perhaps get away with using them tactically on the battlefield. That's a different topic. For just for the update in this area, I mean, obviously the citizens of Gaza are still suffering terribly, coming under bombing from the Israelis. Israeli forces pulling out, though, to some extent. In Beit Hanun, in Gaza itself, reports that Hamas have been able to retake this area here. They've been able to retake this area from the Israeli Defense Forces. The Israeli Defense Forces are having a very tough time fighting in Gaza for lots of reasons. One of them being that they don't have the knowledge of the area like the Hamas fighters do, and they don't have the access to the tunnels like the Hamas fighters do. There is footage out now of a Hamas fighter literally popping up from a small hole in the ground, placing a charge on a Merkava tank, and then jumping back in the hole. There's been a number of these videos, but another one popped up yesterday. But this is the sort of thing which makes it very difficult for the Israelis to hold these locations. So while they may get in there, they may destroy all the buildings. Hamas fighters are living and operating underground and popping up when the Israelis don't expect them, and inflicting damage on them in that way. There's also reportedly some challenges with the Trophy active protection system. So the Trophy active protection system is an Israeli developed by a company called Rafael company, French company. Sorry, anyhow, who have developed a active protective system where what this does is mounted on actually I might have a picture of it here. Is mounted on a here we go. Something like this, if you can see this. Mounted on the side of the tank is a radar detection system which is able to detect incoming anti-tank missiles. It can then identify the type of the missile, make a decision about what's going to be done. Is it a threat or not? Perhaps identify where it originated from and then inform the crew of where it originated from if it's not necessarily an immediate threat. And then if it is considered a threat, then it can actually strike out, so it can fire an explosive projectile at it to destroy the incoming round. Now, the Trophy system has some weaknesses which seem to be being identified by Hamas. They're not good against top attacks. This image here, I think, is a little misleading in that this red bubble seems to indicate that the tank is protected all around in sort of 360 semicircle. It seems as though top attack, it isn't protected from that, and there have been some examples so far of tanks suffering from that. It's also no good against kinetic attacks. So a kinetic projectile attack isn't an explosive RPG head that comes in. These are more of a dart-like piece, so a piece of metal which is fired with just high kinetic energy, which hits and then pierces the side of the tank, or even plasma type shaped charges where a charge explodes and pushes down a shell of copper, for example, putting such pressure and heat onto it that it turns into like a liquid plasma jet of metal, and that strikes the tank. The Trophy is no good against those, but it appears as though there may be other weaknesses being identified, and this is due to a number of Merkava tanks and Namer armoured personnel carriers that have reportedly been destroyed, damaged, and successfully attacked by RPGs of the type that the Trophy system should or would have been expected to have neutralised. Yeah, just a little bit on Benjamin Netanyahu. In the papers today, the Supreme Court of Israel has struck down his government's proposed law, which would have stopped court judges from overriding government decisions that they felt were unreasonable. So if the government had made some decision, if the Supreme Court judges thought it was unreasonable, they could override it. They had that right to do that. Benjamin Netanyahu and his government have attempted to raise a bill or put in place a change to that so that those court judges could no longer override the government. The Supreme Court says, no, you're not taking that away from us. So it's a loss in the courts for Benjamin Netanyahu. His close ally, the US Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, has just announced to American Congress that he has made a second emergency determination, this time for $147 million worth of arms sales to Israel. This will include things like fuses and primers for the 155 millimeter artillery shells. So this comes after the earlier 9th of December emergency determination that he made, which was a $106 million sale of 155 millimeter shells to Israel. There's been some concern around this from Ukraine. If you've been following Ukraine, as you can imagine, as Ukraine has been struggling to get the number of 155 millimeter shells that it would like for its conflict with Russia. And it appears as though these shells were most likely originally earmarked for Ukraine, but were then siphoned off to Israel. Now, Blinken is doing this because this is the only sort of way that he and Biden and the administration have at the moment to provide funding to Israel. The American Congress, in particular the Republicans and Mike Johnson, the leader of the House Republicans, they have a clever political move for them. They have tied one of their big desires, which is US border security, so securing the southern border with Mexico. They have tied that directly to the approval of aid for both Ukraine and Israel. In Ukraine's case, it's $64 billion, and in Israel's case, it's $16 billion. This was being discussed at the end of last year, in December of 2023, just before Congress took recess. It wasn't approved by that stage because Mike Johnson has said that for the House to approve it, they will need, where the Republicans have majority, they will need to see concrete measures from the White House about how the border will be secured. Now, the border is a big burning issue in the United States. As an example, just today it's been announced that Governor Gavin Newsom in California has now put into law that illegal migrants in California will now be able to get full state-sponsored medical treatment. So the headlines of this are saying that if you're a Californian and you are working, your tax dollars will now be paying for illegal immigrants to get medical care. The Democrats like the open border. The open border for them represents a means to get fresh voters into the country. There are large numbers, thousands of people a day coming through the border, and over time these people are settling in the United States and they will vote for the Democrats. The majority of them will vote for the Democrats, and the Biden administration is aware of this, and that's why they are saying all the right things about border security but stalling on doing it. And if you remember when Trump was in power, his big promise was, we're going to build a wall, we're going to stop this. He was a Republican, and the Democrats tried everything they could to stop him from doing it, from getting funding to be able to do it. Democrat ChuckGrassley, he has announced that he would support a bill to enable undocumented or illegal immigrants, as they're called in the US, to be able to, if they passed a background check, to be able to join the American Armed Forces. And they would then receive citizenship. So you can see the Democrats, their real plan is to get as many people into the country as they can, get them jobs, put them into the military, give them citizenship, and then they can go and vote, and they'll vote as Democrats, is the plan there. Obviously, the Republicans don't like this idea, and so they have said to Biden, because Biden's in a tricky position and the clock is ticking. He's coming up to the 2024 November election. He needs to win that election. His approval ratings are down the tubes at the moment. And going into an election cycle with a failure in Ukraine, a failure in Israel, particularly because if he couldn't get funding for them through, that's a problem. Now, this is where the Republicans have him over a barrel, because if he wants the funding to avoid that problem, he then has to do something to secure the border wall, and then he's got a problem with his own voter base in that space. So it's very clever politics from Mike Johnson. here. But again, probably a win overall for the Republicans, because the Republicans, I think, have reached the point where they're like, Ukraine, they understand what's happening in Ukraine. It's not going to be won by Ukraine. They don't want to spend any more money in there. They see it as a waste. When you think of the 130 or whatever it is, $1 billion that the US have given, with another 64 possibly, so it might be getting up to 150, 190, whatever it might be. That would build a lot of infrastructure in the US, if that were applied in the US rather than being given to another nation. So you take that combined with what they're talking of giving to Israel and what they already give to Israel each year. There's probably in a 2-year period, there's $250 billion, $250 billion. You could probably fix a lot of roadways, build a few hospitals, that kind of thing in the States. And I think the general public in the States are starting to wise up to that now. And the Republicans feeling the wind blowing that way, saying, okay, if we get told, if it gets publicised that we stop the funding, we'll say, well, it was you, Joe, because you wouldn't do the border wall, and we don't think we're going to cop that much flack for stopping the funding to Ukraine. Stopping the funding to Israel is interesting that they tied that there, because in the past there would have been no way that would have been done. That would have been just a separate item and it would have been rubber stamped straight away. But demographically, in the United States, things are changing. The overwhelming support for Israel, because of the way they have mismanaged this conflict with Gaza, and just the carpet bombing of kids, has just blown a lot of support for them internationally and in the States. John Mearsheimer, he has really clearly called out that the US is tied to Israel in this conflict, because Israel can't continue these attacks without support from the US. If the US were to pull its support now, the conflict would stop. And so people will look back in time and go, okay, US, you were effectively in their shoulder, hip to hip with Israel in this slaughter of civilians and children. But Mearsheimer has also mentioned in a recent interview, there's been a recent Harvard survey which indicates that in America, the survey of 18 to 24-year-olds, in that age group, 51% of them believe that Hamas were justified in what they did on the 7th of October. In the age group of 25 to 34, 48% of them believe that Hamas were justified. So you average it out from the age of 18 to 34, which is a large voting block there. About 50% of them feel that Hamas were justified. So if Biden rolls into this election still supporting Israel, hip to hip, giving lots of money to Israel, a number of these voters, now a lot of these will be Democratic voters, a number of them are going to turn against him, which is something you would never have expected over an issue to do with Israel. So there are some challenges coming both for Biden as he tries to come up to this election and needs to manage all of these different events and somehow turn them into a win, which is why we're starting to see things popping up in Western media now, headlines saying, that a strong Ukraine and a Ukraine that is able to operate independently is all that's needed for a win. Whereas in the past it was Russia will be pushed back to their 1991 borders and Putin will be overthrown. It's the only way we can have victory. That's what it started out at in February of 2022. We can see the narrative is starting to change. And I think we can see the narrative even starting to change here in Israel now, with troops being pulled out. The talk of moving to a new phase where they're just going to be targeting high value targets, which would, I guess, allow them to stop the carpet bombing. And so we're starting to see changes here because the Israeli incursion into Gaza has not been successful for Israel, not quickly successful. Had it all been done and dusted in a week, they might have got by. But now, after 3 months of this, and as it continues into 2024, the pressure from the US to shut this down will grow. That will put pressure on the Israelis to shut it down. The same thing, pressure happening in Ukraine, that's going to shut that down. Interesting to watch and just see what happens here, to see if this if there is a backing off, and if that's enough to placate the likes of Yemen, because there's pressure coming from them blockading the Red Sea. globally, commercially, financial pressure there, if it's going to be enough to placate Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now, there has been Israeli attacks continuing into Lebanon and vice versa. Hezbollah attacks into northern Israel. We just need to just wait and see. If this is really a pullback, that may allow things to de-escalate. However, if it isn't, if there's some ulterior motive here, or if perhaps the wheels are already in motion and it has gone too far, it would not take very much for the Houthis or Hezbollah to reignite a conflict in this area, or Israel, for Israel just to be annoyed and fire one too many missiles into southern Lebanon, which may be enough to kick off Hezbollah. And if Hezbollah get involved, then this becomes a very serious conflict in the Middle East. All right. Thank you for watching. I hope you're enjoying the show. If you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.